My apologies. There was a internet disruption and the previous video may have cut off just a little bit, so I want to review that last section. Anne Hutchinson in 1634 is accused of sedition because she criticized Puritan leaders, and part of this accusation is that she initially disagreed with these male leaders who believed that God could only communicate to males who would then share his word with the parishioners. Now, Puritans were firm in their patriarchal hierarchy, and in criticizing this view, she was criticizing men's roles not only in the church as ordained by God, but she was also criticizing men's roles within society as well. So ultimately, she is charged with sedition, and she ends up being, kicked out of this community. She and her followers, because she did have some followers, left and ended up in Providence. And finally, we see that some of the warring that is taking place in other parts of the world sort of spills over and impacts what's taking place here in the New World in North America. Now, the Pequot were former English allies, and they posed a threat to the Puritans and the Pilgrims because they were opposed to colonial expansion. Now, of course, they were opposed to colonial expansion because that would mean less land for the natives. In 1637, the English and the Narragansett natives attacked the Pequot, killing 400. Puritans and Pilgrims, again, are a threat to all natives. However, they are attempting to ally with some groups. Now, what is important here is that many of the natives that are killed of this 400, it does include men, but also women and children. Puritans in England had fought against King Charles in a civil war that had begun in 1642. In this conflict, Parliament is pitted against the king. Puritan Oliver Cromwell led the Protestant parliamentary forces to victory, and ultimately Charles I is executed, and Parliament establishes a republican commonwealth. Now, Cromwell rules largely as a military dictator until his death in 1658. At this point, Charles II is recalled to the throne, and the Puritans really realize that their only hope is that they leave this part of the world and go toward North America in search of some type of godly society. In the 1640s, England, again in the midst of civil war, neglects the colonies, and as they are neglecting the colonies, this helps to solidify this uprising of Puritans who were led by Cromwell. Now, during the Civil War, the English settlements had expanded throughout parts of New England. And these areas are developing without any sort of oversight or input from the Crown. Now, this is important because this is about 100 years before the Revolution, but we see the foreshadowing in the 1640s. So again, these colonies are expanding, new towns are being built, and although they consider themselves English and they largely practice English law, they really have no oversight or input. The English acquired New Amsterdam, and by 1674, they were able to claim dominance in North America along the coast. Now, after the English Civil War, the restored monarchy really redirects its attention to North America. Once things are sort of back to normal in England, they recognize that things have gotten a bit out of hand in the colonies, and so they begin to try to find ways to reclaim dominance here in North America. They redirect their attention and they, of course, acquire New Amsterdam from the Dutch, and they rename that territory New York. At the same time, there is a increase in trade, population, and politics in North America that has largely gone unchecked because it was so disconnected from Europe. Now, at this particular point, had England really attempted to rein the colonies in, the rest of American history might be very different. But with an ocean between them, wars in England and other colonies throughout the world to manage, England doesn't really pay much attention to what's going on in North America. In 1671, the English sought to exert more complete control over the Wampanoag natives, and they demanded that the Wampanoag surrender their weapons. In return, the Wampanoag raided English communities, and the English authorities retaliated. Now, what is important here is the natives aren't necessarily making a distinction between the English and the colonists at this point. And the colonists do consider themselves to be English, and they do have some relationships with different native groups, but they tend to see all natives as natives. Now, Metacom, who is the leader, who's known as a leader by the English, tries to force the English out. And in order to achieve this, Metacom forges an alliance with the Narragansett natives. Now, this leads to an ensuing war that is very brutal and very bloody, and it truly comes very close to completely annihilating the Native Americans in the New England area. So keep in mind that what we're seeing in the 1660s and into the 1670s is really similar in terms of the conflict that will be brewing in about another 100 years. When King Philip's War ended, the Indians were really largely out of weapons, they were out of ammunition, and ultimately Metacom is killed. The Indians who do survive King Philip's War move north and are assimilated into various tribes that have been allied with the French. Now, this is important because the French, of course, have a very strained relationship with England. New York colonists and Indians formed what was known as the Covenant Chain in 1677, and they formed this covenant in hopes of preventing future conflict. But unfortunately, we know that conflict is literally just around the corner.